Thank you so much for joining and welcome to the webinar Achieving Quality Education for Internally Displaced Children and Young People. This webinar is hosted jointly by INEE and Save the Children. So before we get going, just a few housekeeping things to share with you. So due to the high number of participants in the webinar, all the microphones and cameras are muted. Only the presenters can speak and show their video. However, participants can write questions in the Q&A box, which you'll see at the bottom, or in the chat function. So please use those. We've got closed captioning available. If you don't see the closed captioning at the bottom of your Zoom window, you should be able to see a CC sign that you can click on. If it's not immediately available, I think you go to the buttons at the side. The webinar is being conducted in English, and we have live interpretation into Arabic, French, Portuguese and Spanish. You need to go to the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Click on that and choose the language you would like to listen in. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording and all the related presentations will be shared with the rest, everybody that's joined today via email, and it will also be posted to the INEE website. Before I introduce our panelists, I just wanted to say a few words to place today's discussion in context. So at the end of 2020, according to data shared by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, a record 55 million people were forcibly displaced within their country, so internally displaced. This is the highest figure ever recorded, and it's estimated that 23 million of those are below the age of 18, so in other words, of formal school age. However, we also know that internally displaced children and young people are frequently denied access to quality education due to discrimination, and also because of financial or legal reasons or security challenges faced by their families. So this webinar aims to highlight the real life and day-to-day challenges that young IDPs experience when seeking access to quality education. Which is obviously fundamental to their, it's not only their human right, but it's fundamental to their healthy development and their future life chances. The webinar brings together a really diverse set of panelists who will be sharing their own experiences and their own perspectives on both the challenges and the opportunities faced to support the learning of internally displaced children and young people, and also to really kind of highlight the need for action on this front. INEE and Save the Children have been working on this issue both separately and together, and some of the findings and messages from our work will be shared today. We believe that education of internally displaced children and young people requires increased attention and action at all levels, and we really hope that this webinar will be an opportunity to share perspectives from the different panelists and really help increase the discussion and debate on this issue so that all internally displaced children and young people can enjoy their right to quality education. So without saying too much more, because we've got a wonderful group of panelists, let me introduce you to each of the panelists, to all of the panelists, and then I will invite each of them to speak in turn. So we have with us today, our first speaker will be Afisa Tu, who's a 13-year-old internally displaced girl from Niger, who Save the Children supports. She's joined by Seydou Hassan, who's the communication lead for Save the Children in Niger.
Children's direct inclusion into the national education system yielded really positive integration results with internally displaced people and with the host communities. But this is while this is an important starting point to build social cohesion, for this to work as a durable solution, education systems need to adapt and respond to the needs of internally displaced children, particularly thinking around language of instruction, flexibility in enrolment documents, and to tackle discrimination, as we've already heard. Next slide, please. So both INEE and Save the Children heard a number of similar challenges that internally displaced children and young people face in accessing quality of education. And these include a reluctance to identify themselves as internally displaced people because of perhaps stigma or discrimination in their area, for reasons of insecurity. For example, we know that in countries such as Afghanistan, there were 70 incidents of attacks on education in 2019 alone. And an attack on education can take many forms. Students and teachers at all levels can be harmed, they can be attacked, they can face injury, they can be deliberately or indiscriminately killed, assaulted or threatened. And schools have been destroyed in attacks. And also children and teachers can be harmed on the way to or from schools and learning centres. And of course, this all creates a sense of community of fear and increases the likelihood of dropouts as parents fear sending their children back to school. We also heard that teachers need much more support themselves to be able to teach the complex needs that internally displaced children may have. And we also heard that the education needs to be tailored specifically for the needs that children have. So thinking about how they can compensate learning loss, targeted remedial education, and support with the transition into the formal system. So these were some of the challenges. But at the same time, we also heard that in addition, COVID-19 has also really exacerbated these challenges further. Next slide, please. All the evidence points towards internally displaced children having more difficulty getting back to school following COVID-19 school closures. Countries are already seeing higher dropout rates amongst internally displaced children. These are some of the reasons that we found. Internally displaced children are less likely to have access to adequate materials and technical devices or connectivity for distance learning. And they may live in remote areas or in temporary camps where connectivity is just really hard to find. I say the Children's Study of Internal Displacement in the Democratic Republic of Congo found that internally displaced people living in poverty were facing learning difficulties due to a lack of distance learning devices, including radio. Whereas in Colombia, the local authorities responding to education in areas with internally displaced children face difficulties in organising, distributing and using the online materials prepared by the Ministry of Education. This was due to limited access to computers and to the internet. And of course, children with disabilities require adapted technology and assistive devices to learn remotely, and amongst the internally displaced population in many countries, having these adaptive devices is really difficult to come by. Next slide, please. However, we did hear a number of really promising best practices and case studies in the roundtables and in the case studies. We heard about the role of community-based organisations in establishing non-formal education and protective programming. For example, community education committees in Somalia actually act as brokers between internally displaced populations and decision makers. And the efforts of these community actors really should be supported so that they can inform education policy and planning. In Afghanistan, the steps taken by community-based education initiatives really allows for the resources to be put in the right place so that the government can then take over from the community education initiatives once they're able to do so. We also heard that if a Ministry of Education has a specific legal framework that recognises internally displaced children and young people's needs and puts procedures in place, this can really help facilitate access to education. For example, in Colombia, the government investment in alternative and flexible education programmes help to adjust to the specific needs of internally displaced people and drive them through the formal education system. But this really depended on sufficient funding and monitoring, particularly during children's transition into the formal system. And on to the last slide, you'll see a number of the recommendations that we made. Maybe they're not there. So we had a number of recommendations. You can read them in the reports, but these included things such as, of course, education is a right recognised to all children, no matter their migration status. We really have to listen to internally displaced children and facilitate their participation in decision making. We should strengthen the quality of education, focusing on the needs of teachers, and ensure equal access to non-formal and formal education, ensuring it's accredited. And of course, we need to build education sector resilience to respond better to conflict and disaster risks that could cause displacement, and ensure schools and learning centres are really safe spaces. And lastly, one of the recommendations is about ensuring that education in emergencies is really well funded, both by ministries of education, but also the international community. I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. I think it's really, important to hear both the challenges, but also the best practices. And what's really, I think, important from both the INEE report and the Save the Children report is that those reports are both informed directly by young IDPs, by IDP teachers, and by practitioners that work with them. So I think, we know there's challenges. We also know there are solutions. I'm sorry that your last slide was missing. We will make sure that that is there before we send out the slides. But and also just to say, so thank you very much to Emma. And before I go to our next presenter, I also wanted to say that for the interpreters, I'll try and speak more slowly because I know you're doing an amazing job and we get carried away. So all of us will try to speak a little bit more slowly. Thank you very much. So Jamil, can I hand over to you now to speak about the experience, the direct experience that you've had working with IDP communities in Northwest Syria? If I can hand over to you, Jamil.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for the colleagues in Save the Children and in the INEE for giving this opportunity to share with you some of the main challenges that IDPs children and teachers are facing in Northwest Syria. I'm gonna take you over or through or main slides here to see or or to give an overview about the situation here and what are the best practices and our response, and what are the main challenges that IDP children and teachers are facing in our context. Next, please. Okay, in Northwest Syria, when I say Northwest Syria, I mean two governorates, specifically, I'm talking here about Idlib and Aleppo governorates. We have 1.7 million IDPs. People are living here, including 28,000 people with disabilities. 322,000 of families are living in 1,401 IDP sites here, including 29% girls, 29% boys, 22% women, and 20% men. Most of them are living in self-settled, or established IDP sites. Next. Here we focus on Dana subdistrict. Dana subdistrict it is one of the subdistricts under Idlib governorate, which hosted the highest number of IDPs in Northwest Syria. We can see here we have in Dana subdistrict we have 603 IDP sites existing, based on our last report in April. We have 26% of these IDP sites don't have learning spaces, whereas we have 74% of these IDP sites don't have learning spaces, and just 26 of them have learning spaces. In these IDP sites, we have around 260 thousand IDPs children are living, are school-age children are existing there. Just around 80,000 of them are enrolled in the schools. So the percentage of enrollment just 32%, whereas we have 68% of the school-age children are not enrolled in schools. Next. Here, we conducted in order to go deeply to know what are the main challenges that IDPs children facing actually in the IDP sites here in Northwest Syria. We conducted like surveys with 350 IDPs school-age children in 35 schools, in 50 camps in Harim, Dana, Darkous sub-districts here in Northwest Syria and Idlib Governorate, asking them about the main challenges they are facing when accessing or looking to access their quality education, and the following key findings. 35% of them actually mentioned the main challenge they are facing is the inadequate, let me say, education supplies. I'm talking here about the school bags, stationery kits and textbooks. 21% of the surveyed children also mentioned the poor financial condition led them to stop their education and go work and support their families. 16% of the surveyed children also mentioned that mentioned the main challenge they are facing also or here is the spaces or the distance, let me say, between their homes, tents, and the learning spaces they are studying in. 14% of the surveyed children mentioned an inadequate number of learning spaces existing. As we mentioned previously, we have 74% of the IDP sites don't have learning spaces in Dana sub-district. In addition to this, we have 12% of the surveyed children mentioned that wash facilities at the classrooms and learning environment is not let me say, prepared and equipped well with all the needs and tools for children with disabilities. 6% also of the surveyed children mentioned that the main challenge they are facing here is the frequent displacement and multiple times displacement taking place from time to another, from camps to another camps, from communities to another communities. 5% also mentioned the main challenge they are facing is the spread of COVID-19. And 3% of them mentioned the main challenge they are facing is the inadequate qualified teachers in the IDP sites. Now we will move next to the to see the challenges that IDP teachers are facing in the IDP sites here. We conducted let me say surveys also with 3 IDPs teachers here in many communities in Northwest Syria, asking them about the main challenges they are facing and the following. 48.5% of the teachers mentioned the main let me say challenge they are facing is the monthly or the lack of monthly incentives. It is one of the big challenges we are facing in our context here. Also, in addition to this, the low scale of incentives in general in comparison with their let me say basic needs to survive here. Second, 27% of the surveyed teachers mentioned that classroom intents are not prepared well and need rehabilitation and need also a source of power, fans and lights. 20% of the surveyed teachers or IDPs teachers here mentioned that learning spaces don't have the appropriate teaching tools and materials they need to provide and their education activities. 15% of the surveyed teachers also mentioned they need training and capacity building. 15% also they mentioned that COVID-19 spread caused or made some delay in the the whole education process in their let me say during the academic year. 14.4% of the surveyed teachers mentioned frequent displacement and caused disruption and interruption in the whole education process. 12% of the surveyed teachers also mentioned that the inconsistency in the education projects and sustainability, let me say, of education projects and interventions is one of the main challenges they are facing. 4.1% of the surveyed teachers mentioned the distance also between their learning spaces and their homes and tents. 3.7% mentioned the unstable security conditions. I'm talking about the IDP sites, which should be safe and locations where people are resorting to. Next, now we will go to see here some of the key here we will go and try to see or shed the light here on our response. As said, we implemented 6 education projects in Northwest Syria and the IDP sites specifically, and managed to reach 70 like or to support 78 schools, including 52,000 like IDP children, and supporting 1,570 education and admin staff. As summary, like in key figures, we managed to distribute 43,000 school bags and stationery kits. We also managed to print 31,000 of to print and distribute 31,000 of textbooks to the children, provide BSS activities and recreational activities to 52,000 IDPs children here, to enroll and provide catch-up classes to around 4,000 IDPs children, to provide remedial classes to around 14,000 IDPs children, and provide formal education services to around 47 IDPs children. We also actually managed to conduct around 85 back to learning campaigns. In addition to this, we trained and paid the monthly incentives to around 1,570 teachers and supporting staff in 78 schools. We also provided 78 schools with the running costs they need, like to work properly. We also provided the winterization support, heating fuel and heaters to 64 schools. We also distributed 76 cleaning and disinfection material kits to 24 schools after the spread of COVID-19. We established 40 new classrooms in tents and rehabilitated 382 classrooms also. We provided 78 schools with the safety and security equipment like fire extinguishers, first aid kits, security plans, and we established 78 parent-teacher association in these like schools. Now we will go to see the support actually the education cluster is providing in order like to better like the education like response for the IDP sites. Can we go to the second slide, please? Okay, here we can see actually the education cluster that is like actually assigned a focal point to track the needs and gaps of IDPs like children in the IDP sites in Northwest Syria. And actually in this, we have the focal points here are providing a monthly update about the needs and gaps to share with all the cluster members and donors on a monthly basis. This is here we have the link of some like let's say products and dashboards about the needs or published on a monthly basis. Secondly, actually also in the cluster we worked on a framework for the education in camps in Northwest Syria. Here we have the link actually for this like let me say package, which includes the minimum that any like let me say education provider or actor or NGO let me say is planning to provide or are planning to provide the education like response. This is the minimum package they need to consider. Here we have the link for this like let me say package. Also we worked on a non-formal education framework. What are actually the minimum like to be like more standardized like interventions for all the all the non-formal education like and say activities. I'm talking here about like the catch-up classes, remedial classes, self-learning programs, accelerated like let's say learning programs, also basic literacy and numeracy, and all this kind of like and say non-formal education interventions. You can see them here. In addition to this, we after the spread of COVID-19, the schools are reopened again in the IDP sites. Here we worked on a guide for the safe reopening to the schools. Here we have the link to this like let me say guide. In addition to this, I'm gonna like give a concrete like in figures what are the results of like let me say advocacy between 2020 2021. Here from actually the number of IDP sites which have education services has increased from 113 to 156 in the IDP sites where we are working now. In addition to this, the number of learning spaces also has increased from 116 to 156. And also the number of enrolled children in the IDPs or IDPs enrolled children has been increased from 57,000 to 80,000. This is like in like numbers concretely what have we achieved over or like any comparison between 2020 and 2021. Actually, I hope you enjoyed the info. Actually, it is really very like bad like situation regarding like the education response. 74% of the IDP sites don't have education services. Just like 32% of the school-age children are enrolled in the schools in the IDP sites here. Over. If you have any questions, I'm ready to answer your questions. Please send your questions to the chat box. Over.
Jamil, thank you so much for that really detailed presentation, because I think what it does, it really kind of brings home, like from the global perspective and, you know, to the kind of, you know, a particular context. And I think when people think of Syria, they often think of the refugee population, and maybe people, you know, don't always think initially about those that have been internally displaced. And I think you've pointed out a few things that really kind of struck me. In addition to the numbers, as you said, 74% of the sites don't have learning spaces, and, you know, only 32% of children enrolled. But you also raised a really important point around COVID-19, and obviously schools were closed in many contexts where there are IDPs, and this has been over the last year an added burden. So we'll come back if people have questions and answers, but
just an like quick here piece of information. When COVID-19 like spread, actually the learning spaces are closed, actually, and there is no physical access ensured to the learning spaces. And we started, like MC, working on different like MC approaches and like methodologies in order like to continue the provision of education services. We adopted like the distance learning approach in the IDP sites here, but actually this is like makes it like worse. Just around like 40% of the children who were enrolled and attending physically just have access to the online education. So it's makes it like really very much complicated, actually, even when going to distance learning as an alternative for the physical learning spaces.
Thank you. I think that's really, really helpful addition to know, actually. And as I say, something to think about the situation that COVID has exacerbated, you know, in crisis context and for IDP populations. So thank you very much. I'll just hand over now. I'm very delighted to welcome our last panelist, and that's Ms. Seema Samar, who's a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel. So Seema, if I could invite you to speak now.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I'm delighted to be here today to participate in this important event on a topic that is crucial to the work of the high-level panel, ensuring access to education for displaced children and young people. I'm from Afghanistan, where better access to education is so badly needed for the children and youth who are displaced. So I care about this issue deeply, personally. And this moment, as I'm speaking to you, thousands of people are being displaced in the last weeks and going to be displaced with increased violence in Afghanistan. I would like to extend my sincere thanks to INEE and Save the Children for organizing today's important webinar, and also for your recent reports on ensuring quality education for IDPs. I would also like to thank my distinguished fellow presenter, particularly my displaced sister from Nigeria. To make progress on these issues, it is so important to hear directly from the people who are experiencing this crisis. In late 2019, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres announced the establishment of the high-level panel on the internal displacement in response to the worsening global displacement crisis and following the request of nearly 60 member states. The panel is tasked with presenting a report to Mr. Guterres with recommendation for improving the prevention of and response to internal displacement, with particular attention achieving government-led durable solution. The panel held its inaugural meeting in February 2020, and of course, as you all know, due to the COVID, we were not able to have physical meetings, but we continue to work online and virtually. After months of receiving input, carrying out analysis and consolidating its work, the panel is presently at the stage of testing, elaborating and revising its conclusion and recommendation. And we are currently on target to deliver the final report to the UN Secretary General by the end of September this year. The issue of education is particularly important for the panel, and I was glad to attend along with the other panel member the consultation in May this year with INEE, Save the Children and International Displacement Monitoring Center, and the Global Education Cluster on Education of IDP Children and Young People, which was an important contribution to our work. We know that the 55 million IDPs in the world, around half of them are under age of 18, or most probably it might be more, because you have two mother and father, and then you have 4 children. So it might be a little more than even the half. Trapped in displacement for years, they face acute suffering, food insecurity, exploitation and abuse, and other violation of their human rights. When young people in particular are in the terrible position of being forced to flee their homes, their access to education is ripped away. And this must be restored as quickly as possible. Education is a human right, and ensuring that displaced girls and boys are able to go to school is an important and emergency response, as it is facilitating pathway to solution. And I think I have to add here that according to this, the need of the children, the consideration of the culture and the tradition should be taken in place. For example, in Afghanistan, we need to have female teachers in order to convince the family to let their daughters go to school. Having access to education can assist children and youth to eventually find jobs and livelihood. Something that is so important to breaking free from the harm and lasting impact caused by displacement. In fact, access to quality education is something that was highlighted through the consultation, and also the previous speakers mentioned about it, with IDP themselves as basic essential for long-term solution, but unfortunately remains a persistent challenge. Ultimately, the panel believed that ensuring access to national education system is the most sustainable way to provide displaced children with quality learning opportunity long-term. But in many places, integrating displaced children into local school is hampered by affecting those systems themselves. School buildings can be destroyed or occupied. We see it these days in Afghanistan, or there is a lack of teacher and overcrowded classrooms. There are also obstacles for IDP children who may have lost years of education during period of flight, face language barrier, or have to pay fee their families cannot afford, as they are, unfortunately, the absolute majority are really below poverty line. Overcoming these challenges requires attention to the public education infrastructure and support for teachers, and often may call for targeted assistance for IDP children and youth, particularly for those who have faced gaps in their schools. In context where the local education system was severely disrupted or was not present even prior to the crisis, the panel believed that the community-based learning can provide useful interim measures. In fact, in Afghanistan, the Ministry of Education has actually established a dedicated department for community-based education as a way to help the transition to formal education. But it have not reached to every displaced children in the country, in reality, in the ground. In addition to the benefit of for individual and communities, access to quality education can also contribute to broader society benefits, such as reducing fragility and achieving the Sustainable Development Goal, including the CG number 4, which is access to education or quality education. Additionally, children who lose access to their schools and education and may be more vulnerable to recruitment, radicalization, trafficking, forced marriage, child marriage, and negative coping strategies. This risk must not be overlooked because it's really seriously, we see the impact in Afghanistan. Overall, a keystone conclusion and recommendation of the panel is for an approach to internal displacement that recognizes IDP as a right-holding citizen and resident, that promotes government responsibility, accountability, and national ownership, and that addresses internal displacement as a development issue in which ensuring sustained access to quality education is essential. And all of this, we agree strongly with the organization of today's event that probably the most important things of all is to listen to and amplify the voices of internally displaced children and young people themselves. I would add also the adults in this case, because what the parents want for their children, and to facilitate their participation in decision affecting their education. This something that was highlighted in May consultation on education as well, and we hope this comes across clearly in our report. As I mentioned before, the panel is in the final stage of its work. We are refining our recommendations and completing the drafting of the report before its final submission in September. Today's meeting is going to help us, and it's very timely, help us to clarify our recommendation on the access to education. Finally, I have to mention that the access to quality education really helps peace building and peace process in the countries. But we have to be careful that access to education should not be politicized, because we saw the politicization of education in Afghanistan. That's why we have Taliban today, and it's not only for Afghanistan. We see it in Pakistan, which is not helpful for the peace building and either development in the world. So thank you very much. Most of the points that I already raised was repetition of the previous speakers, but I just wanted to insist on those points that it is really important for the panel. And thank you very much. If there's any question, I'll be happy to answer. Over.
Thank you so much, Seema, and definitely not a repetition, but reinforcement of those really key points. And, you know, we really thank you for joining today, and we thank all the members of the high-level panel and the Secretary General for the engagement that you've shown. As you said, you mentioned there that we had a smaller consultation with you with panel members earlier this year, and it's fantastic to have you here today. And I think, you know, it's really good to hear from you about how the panel see the importance of education as one of the kind of, you know, to bring long-lasting and durable solutions. And you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals and the role of SDG 4 within that bigger, you know, within the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. Education really has got a key role to play, and also really interesting to hear you referring back to your own experience and your own context of Afghanistan and how important education is. So I just want to say I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ayman, but thank you, Seema, and thank you to all our panelists, to Afisa, to Cecilia, to Emma, and to Jamal. And now I'm going to hand over to Ayman, who's going to moderate the questions and answers section of this webinar. So thank you. Over to you, Ayman, and thanks to everyone.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thanks for the distinctive panelists for such an enriching contribution today, and telling us more stories from the ground. My name is Ayman Quitter. I'm part from the INEE Secretariat, and I will be moderating the Q&A session today. We have received a number of interesting questions from our audience today, so thank you so much for this question. The first question basically can be addressed to all our panelists today. So basically, how can we provide education for IDP children in conflict where there's such difficulty in communication? So again, it's a question about communication, tech support for children from IDP backgrounds. How can we ensure that they have access to education while communication is not available? So any comments, thoughts from our panelists today on this situation? I can see Sema. Yes, please go ahead, Sema. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for asking this question. I think there's no guarantee that we have a proper classroom or we have a proper internet access to those people who are displaced. Unfortunately, they are the most vulnerable people to these issues. I mean, we in countries like Afghanistan, maybe it's same in Syria and Nigeria, that we don't have a proper school structure for the children who are not displaced. But I think what I would try to say that whatever means that could facilitate the access of the children or access to anyone to education, we should use. That can be homeschooling, that can be in the mosque, that can be anywhere that we. And I believe that education is the main tool in order to change the mentality of the society and enable them to stand for their rights. So that is not, we can't really say that one policy or one idea can fit in all the situation. But I think we should know the situation and do whatever we can according to the environment and the situation, and use every possible means in order to do this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sima. I think COVID-19 has taught us a great lesson that education does not only happen in the school, but rather in the community, in the home, everywhere. And I think this is something we need to build up and magnify these outcomes. I can see Emma and Jamil raising your hands. Please go ahead and share your insights on this question. Please go ahead. Probably Jamil can share, or Emma from stories from the ground.
Well, thanks so much, Ayman. I was just wanting to build on what Seema said, and actually you then made the point as well, is that over the last 18 months, we have learned an awful lot about how to deliver education from a distance or in a different way than we were used to in schools and in learning centres, in face-to-face settings. And I really think that, over the next few years, we really have to build on what we've learned during that time to reach the children who were out of school before COVID, to make sure that they have some kind of learning opportunity, as Seema was saying. So we've learned a lot about how to train community facilitators, how to support parents, both with home learning, but also with their own well-being during these times when it's been quite stressful, obviously, being at home, trying to support their children, trying to earn a living and so on. So we've been using radio and learning materials, TV, all sorts of different things. Obviously, all of these aren't in all the most hardest to reach settings, but sometimes there's a good mixture of things available in the country. Some sort of education can be provided to the hardest to reach children. So I really hope that we can learn lessons from this COVID response to reach those children who weren't actually getting any education before, with all these lessons that we've learned from distance education.
That's beautiful, Emma. Thanks so much for sharing all these means of learning everywhere. I can see also, Jamil, you were raising your hands. Probably can step up and tell us more how your organizations working on the ground in Northeast Syria reached unreachable children to have access to education. Any lessons learned, any activities when it comes to education?
Thank you, Ayman. Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Sima, for the previous, comments and answers on this question. I believe that access to education should be there in everywhere to all the children, whether they are IDPs, not IDPs, even actually when they don't have access to safe learning spaces, actually, irrespective or regardless, what are their conditions and what are the challenges they are facing. Okay, education, actually, you know, we have 4 pillars for the education to be there for an education process. We need the student, we need the teacher, we need the school, and we need the curriculum. These are the 4 like main pillars for an education process. Okay. During COVID-19, just I would like to say, bring like a good example from what we did. We were managing like or providing education online for around 1,600 children, okay, IDPs in the IDP sites here. And we use distance learning modality to provide education, and instead like after the spread of COVID-19, schools are closed, no access. We still have around 150 IDP children. They don't have access to the online education. So actually, it was one of the big challenges that we faced here in the IDP sites in Northwest Syria. What we did, we allocated 2 days in each week for the teachers in the learning spaces here. Okay, and we put those children into small groups of 6 to 8. Okay, and actually we when dividing those children into like these groups, we put them like in groups of boys and girls, respecting the cultural like background and norms here in this community and the background of the community here actually in Syria. Okay, and after this we printed some materials and distributed them for those like children, and each like group of those children were receiving like 3 periods per day for the main subjects covering English, Arabic, math, and one for the awareness raising about the preventive measures of COVID-19. Actually, that was a good example that I see, and I believe actually education cannot be stopped. When there is like a will, there is a way to educate your kids, to improve your like say generation. Actually, education should not be stopped under like any circumstances. Okay, even for example for the children at the lower like grades from grade like 1 to 4, we should like depend on the parents and caregivers, educate them, raise their awareness, how like let me say to follow up the duties of the children, how to provide let me say or how what kind of like let me say online programming that their children can attend, whether like through radio or TV whatsoever. Okay, how those like parents and caregivers okay can follow and track the duties of the children, their like let me say learning outcome, provide support to them. Okay, this is I think a good example. Actually, parents during COVID-19 they proved to be the second like teachers upon whom we are depending really to ensure the continuity of education at home. It is like a chamber like stage, and we hope like COVID-19 will be over soon, and all the children will come back to their like let me say learning spaces and have direct access to physical quality education services where they are. Over.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. That was very informative and insightful. That you know there are a number of factors that needs to be taken into consideration when we provide education, and it's not only the teacher's job, but rather the parents, the community, to contribute in advancing the education. I have another question related to inclusive education, actually, which Cecilia talked thankfully about. So basically, this is a comment from Ahmed Rubai, who's from sharing a bit of information from Yemen. Basically, he said that students in Yemen are considered displaced children because Yemen is blocked by the conflict. Thus, they live in semi-refugee camps in their regions. Also, their teachers suffer from non-employment or non-payment salaries. We know that this is an important or big challenge for the Yemeni teachers, not being paid for many months or many years actually now. So my question is, how can we help in providing qualified inclusive education for those millions of IDPs? Probably Cecilia, if you have any thoughts on this question, especially when you talked about the importance of inclusive education and accessibility of inclusive education for children for IDPs. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ayman. Actually, I wanted to answer the second question after the first, but then you jumped the questions. Okay, let's go to inclusive.
Feel free to answer any.
Okay, right. Well, let me answer this very quickly, and maybe other members of the panel may want to answer this about inclusive education. One of the things that I emphasized in my report to the General Assembly in 2019 on the rights of internally displaced children, in which Save the Children, by the way, had contributed a lot, is really to have this inclusive education, whereby it is not merely in regard to the needs and the rights of IDP children, of course, but it is actually a community-based education. And this is, and referring to the previous discussion, I like very much the comment of one of the participants, where we may really need to separate schooling per se in the traditional sense from education. And I think the comments in the first to the first question was very much addressed to that conclusion. But inclusive education basically means not just education, because one of the things that I really would like to emphasize is that it's central to protection, first of all, that children have education, but also in providing any type of education that are able to be provided. It is also very important that the other issues of protection, particularly those related to possible obstacles to such quality education, are taken into account. And naturally, gender is one of them. Ethnic identity, language, etc., things that have actually been put on the chat. And inclusive education also means ensuring that the system works for both displaced and non-displaced, so that we are also in the process of social cohesion, processes of social cohesion. And in this case, as I think Seema said, education by itself is also a tool for non-discrimination and protection. If you will permit me, maybe if I may just jump to the other question. And actually the question is with regard to the experience in Iraq, where there is a problem of education for the displaced people returning to their old homes after the camps were closed by the Iraqi authorities. People may know already that I actually visited Iraq in 2020, just before COVID hit all of us. And after that, the Iraqi authorities tried to close the camps, even in the midst of COVID. And I issued actually a very strong press statement against this. And the problem really is you cannot just have recurring displacement, because that's what happens when you close camps arbitrarily. And here then you find a situation where return actually has put in peril very clearly the education of the IDP children, because most of the return, if not all, have actually been within the context of not having any conditions for durable solutions, including education for the children. So one of my advocacy points on this particular issue, on which I feel very passionate about, is first of all, we have to prevent arbitrary displacement even during displacement. This is what's happening in Iraq right now. My next report to the General Assembly is about prevention of arbitrary displacement, and I have provided a very a hefty analysis of the problem of camp closures in this regard. But secondly, as well, durable solutions in whatever form, return, local integration, or settlement elsewhere in the country, need to incorporate conditions for quality education for internally displaced persons being part of those settlement options. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for sharing. It's really important to hear these remarks that the IDPs and refugees continue to suffer this sense of insecurity and uncertainty when it comes to arbitrary displacement. And I totally join your advocacy point on on the prevention of this really was a cruel, like really measures of arbitrary displacement. Thank you so much for addressing the two questions at the same. Emma, I can see you're raising your hand. Please go ahead if you have any additional thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I just had a few more thoughts as Cecilia was speaking there. I was thinking around something that we've very much been thinking about within Save the Children is how do we reach the most marginalised children first, that way ensuring that the rest of our programming, you know, can then reach the remaining children who are perhaps easier to reach. So really taking an in-depth assessment of who those children are. Are they girls? Are they children with disabilities? Children, you know, internally displaced children, but all the intersecting inequalities that children face. I'm really thinking about how do we reach those children first, and then everything else will kind of hopefully fall in place because we will have already provided, you know, such their programming to reach the most marginalised. And I think a really key thing around this is collecting data, and I think we all know that data on internally displaced children and young people's education is really lacking. We don't know exactly how many children in each country or even region or sub-region. We don't know how many of them are in school or what they're learning. So, you know, gathering that data, particularly on a real-time way, so that we can adapt programming and schooling, is really challenging. And so yeah, definitely something that we are advocating with INEE on and others is how can we really scale up real-time data that we can share publicly with others so that we can really adapt to what children need.
Thank you so much, Emma. I think I also would like to share this comments from one of our attendees, Glory Enemo. It is rather a comment. He said, as a former IDP child in North Uganda, I also recommend that girl children or girl child should be considered to participate in the planning for them. I also add that education is to be top on the priority of displaced children, especially girls and children with disabilities. So thank you so much, Glory, for sharing your thoughts with us today. And let me take Sima comments, and then I'll go to you, Jamil. Thanks.
Yes, thank you again. I think on the forced displacement and arbitrary displacement, Cecilia, thank you for raising that. And I think that in that case, we need to insist on the accountability also, because it's mainly the warring factions who commit war crimes and crimes against humanity and force the people to be displaced. And repeatedly they displaced today, and after 2 months they have to go to another place. I mean, this is the reality in most of the conflict countries. So I think adding accountability on violation of IHL would be something that we also should insist on it. Although I do insist on to have it in the recommendation of the high-level panel for internal displacement as well. Over.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Sima. Jamil, would you like to share some thoughts?
Yes, I would like just to go like and answer maybe like the second question or one of the questions asking about the curriculum that we use in our like schools. Thank you, Emma, for the answer. Just I want to like add something in here. Actually, in each like type of education, we are using like different curricula. Okay, for example, in formal education services, we are using the Syrian interim government curriculum, which is like adopted and used. In non-formal education, in each like type of non-formal education intervention, we have like, let me say, a certain type of curriculum. For example, in catch-up classes, okay, we are using the curriculum B of UNICEF that actually has been like developed and prepared by UNICEF. It is available like in Arabic and I think in 5 languages or more in many countries across the globe. For the remedial classes, actually we are using also certain like, let me say, topics from the formal education curriculum, okay, where the children have certain weaknesses in the main skills, in the main like, let me say, topics in their formal education in the main subjects. For the BSS and actually the recreational activities, we are using the ideal curriculum, and we are using the also the IRC curriculum for social and emotional learning, actually adapted for the Syrian context.
Thanks so much, Jamil. Also, we have a question from Fionn Toma from Cameroon. He said that we have a lot of IDPs in Anglophone regions of Cameroon. What is being done to improve their education? It's getting closer to 6 years now. Is your organization doing any effort in this region? Could we have could we on the ground be of some help? I think a bit of call on collaboration. Not sure any of our panelists would like to answer this question. Pretty holistic, broad question. Sim, I can see you raising your hand. Would you like to step up?
Sorry, I was the hand raises from
no problem. No
but
problem.
I think I just want to say that access to education to anyone, to every age, is a basic human rights. It should not be affected by emergency or any other excuses. The other point that I would like to mention in this regard is that I think in some countries, including in Afghanistan, sometimes they use the respect for culture and respect for religion, not pushing too much on the girls' education, and try to use that excuse in order to not face any challenges by the opposition or Taliban style people. So that is also not should be done, and we should put in consideration that everyone has the right to quality education. Again and again, I think education is a really strong tool for peace building in a country, for sustainable development, for sustainable peace, for reaching the SDG. Not only one SDG 4, but all the SDGs cannot really be reached without education. So let's be open and forceful in this issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sima, for this. And I'm really afraid that we're running out of time for today's webinar. Actually, it's just over the time that is allocated for this webinar. And I really can't thank you all enough, or our distinctive panelists, for your contribution with us today. And there has been a lot to take away from this discussion. And I really hope our attendees also will be benefiting from this enriching discussion. So I would like to conclude this webinar by thanking each one of the amazing panelists today. Fisatu, Cecilia, Ima, Jamil, Seima, thank you so much for sharing your insights and presenting with us today. And also I would like to extend thanks to our amazing audience and attendees who stayed with us throughout this webinar. Thank you so much for your time. And also special thanks, I would like to also second my colleague Kate in thanking Fisatu for your time and your story and your narrative with us today. I think we really need to hear more of these stories, more of these voices of internally displaced people, teachers, parents. They are a really important part of providing education for IDPs. Their stories and their narrative really matter. So education gives every child anywhere, especially IDPs and refugees, strength to carry on. And let's continue to work, and let's make this basic right really accessible to every child. So thank you so much again, and until next time, stay in touch and be well. Thank you so much all.
Thank you very much on behalf of the panel.
Thank you.
Merci tout le monde. Merci à Fisatu.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye, thanks.
Bye. Thanks for the interpreters as well. Thank you.